Hi guys, I'm Eliza Wood, this is my channel, and let's talk about Christmas. So if you saw my last video, you'll know that I was trying to get a Christmas dress done in time for Christmas. And it is now past Christmas, but I am happy to say that I was able to finish the dress. So if you saw my last video, you'll know that I was trying to get a Christmas dress done in time for Christmas. Originally, my due date was a Christmas party that happened at the beginning of December. I was able to get the party dress done, but the fabric that inspired the whole thing was woefully untouched. But no longer. In this video, we're gonna finish it. So continuing on with my history-bounding journey, I chose an open front gown, which I believe was about the Regency era, and I found it in one of my pattern's fashion books. I don't remember which one, so I'll have to look it up, but I will be putting it right here. And also any links or anything I'll talk about, is all of that is going to be in the summary. The open front gown is technically a dress. However, I think the way that I wound up doing it leans more towards coat. So I kind of go back and forth between calling it a dress and a coat. Also, if you watched my last video, you'll know that a lot of my film actually went missing, and unfortunately that also includes the beginning parts of this video. Hopefully I can do a good job of explaining it, but it's only the first part. We'll get back to watching the glittery sewing in a little bit. So starting with the drafting process, I used the bodice block that I made in the last video from that Parisian tailoring method thing in order to make this one. Luckily, the seam lines on the back were pretty much the same. It was just that curved line in the back, and that is also how it is on the open front gown, so at least I didn't have to alter that. I did, however, have to, in the back, alter the height of the waistline. The Parisian tailoring gown ends at the waist. However, a Regency gown has an empire waist, which is more along the lines of about the underbust. As for the front of the gown, there is a much bigger alteration on that one. The open front gown is, as the name suggests, open in the front. This particular gown frames the bust line, which means that I had to figure out where exactly to cut the bust in order for it to be able to do just that. Luckily, I still had a little bit of the mock-up from the Parisian tailoring, and I was able to mark on that where it needed to go in order to frame my bust. But since the neckline falls so low, it actually cut into the dart at the bottom of the pattern, which is a nice thing because that means that I can combine the dart at the front, so it just makes one piece and I won't have an awkward seam right there. I did also extend that center front piece so that it would go all the way across my body instead of ending in the middle, because I intend on buttoning this thing closed. And then of course I made the waistline up to the empire waistline. As for the sleeves, I did use the Parisian tailoring method, but I found that I wasn't particularly fond of the original pattern, only because I wasn't fond of the bend that it took at the elbow. I got it in the right place, I just felt, especially for a directional fabric, it might work well for a non-directional fabric, but the directional fabric, it looked a little weird because the fabric went from going straight down my arm to going at an angle across my arm, and I wasn't particularly fond of that. However, the curve did work in my favor when doing this particular sleeve, because what I did is I lined up the two sleeve patterns together so that the curve went out like this. That would give me a large shoulder, and the armhole would be about the same. I was trying to go for a drumstick pattern. I do feel, however, that it wasn't quite as voluminous as I had wanted it to be, but I think it's cute nonetheless. And finally, for the skirt. The skirt, I did not draft a pattern, as I usually don't draft patterns for skirts because they're usually just triangular or rectangular pieces that gather together at the waistline. I'm not saying they're easy to do, of course. For this particular one, I took whatever was left of the fabric in a rectangle and I cut it so that the waistline would be straight, but the bottom of the dress would go high-low, so high in the front and low in the back. Not by much. I didn't have a lot of fabric, but it hits about the mid-thigh in the front to the mid-calf in the back. Unfortunately, I don't feel that I had enough fabric to really do a Regency skirt justice. So I don't think that I had nearly enough volume in this particular skirt, which is unfortunate, but it is still cute. And finally, we get back to the point at which we have sparkly pretty things to look at. So I'll let us get over to that while I do the rest of the narrating off camera. The final piece I wanted to add deviates from the original dress inspiration, but also stays somewhat in the history-bounding field. I want to add a hood to my coat. This is one of the reasons that I'm starting to feel that it's more of a coat than a dress. I decided to use another pattern from Patterns of Fashion, but honestly, any hood will do. They're pretty easy to design in my opinion, at least a simple one. First I use a measuring tape to figure out how wide I want the hood to frame my face. I chose to go for a more fantastical look, but be careful doing that because in my limited experience, it seems that the wider the hood, the more easily it wants to fall off your head. Then I took half that measurement and drew a straight line in front of the hood. Next, I took a measurement from the front of my head, where I wanted the hood to generally sit, to the back of my head, adding a bit of ease for a more loose fit. That'll be a perpendicular line from the front. From there, I just sketched a hood pattern that looks similar to the one in the book. Mine is going to be a lot bigger though, because the one in the book was close fitting to the person's head, whereas mine is a lot bigger. The back will be gathered down, so I'm not too concerned about just how big it looks right now. And also, the bigger, the more fantastical. The only measurement I did bother to take was at the neckline. I just want to make sure the hood is the same size or slightly larger than the size of the neckline where I intend to attach it to the dress. It would be a real problem if I made it too small. This pattern will be placed on the fold at the top. From there I'll use my handy dandy ruler to mark out a 1/2 inch seam allowance around everything except the front, which got a 1.5 inch. This is because I want to add something there to stiffen the opening. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any of my chalk, so I was forced to use my ink pen, but it luckily was not visible on the other side. Still, I didn't want to risk it, so I did my best not to let any of the ink anywhere near outside the seam allowances. Then, cut it out. I know you're really not supposed to cut things like velvet with more than one layer, but this pattern was simple enough that I was willing to risk it so that I wouldn't have to deal with trying to draw the pattern on both sides. Off camera, I sewed the diagonal sides together, and then I sewed a gathering stitch along the opening in the back of the hood using a 4 on my sewing machine. This stitch will allow me to gather the hood down entirely, which gives it a nice round shape. But, unfortunately, it also leads to a seam that I can't sew with the sewing machine. It's far too thick. It's an easy enough fix though. I'll just whip a few stitches along the gathers to make sure they don't come apart. Pro tip though, make sure that all of the gathers are facing the correct direction. I did not do that, and now I have like this little peak of fabric that's showing through on the right side. It's not really noticeable for anyone who doesn't know, but I know, and it annoys me. For a stiffened edge to frame the face, I decided to use synthetic horsehair braid. It'll make it so that the hood doesn't totally collapse on itself, but also allows for free movement. I'll just wrap that edge of the hood around the braid and fell it into place. I know I said I wasn't going to do any hand stitching in the project, but I honestly don't think a visible machine stitch would look good with this beautiful velvet fabric. So much so that I even fell down the horsehair braid at the bottom of the dress. Once the hood is totally assembled, I evenly space out points around the neckline where I want to attach the hood. I decided to attach at about my collarbone just because I willy-nilly felt like it. It does take a bit of time to get the hood gathered down nicely to fit into the neck hole, but it's worth it to take the time and make it look nice. Don't want the same thing to happen that happened with my skirt. Then it's to the sewing machine to attach it. It's at this point that I'm realizing that this coat really should have a lining to hide the raw edges, at least on the hood when it's down. Unfortunately, I don't really have the time to make one at the moment, so it'll just have to go without. I'll know for next time. Then it's time for more hand felling around the arms and front edges of the coat. I did wind up adding a little bit of fabric to that front strip, if only to give the buttons something a little more stable to work with. I really didn't want to have to deal with it warping because of how stretchy the fabric it was. And since I'm hand stitching anyway, I might as well add on that gold lace that I've been talking about but haven't actually showed you. I got this lace for another project that I don't think I'll ever finish, so I'm super excited to be able to finally use it. I like to use a thread color that's similar to the lace and whip around its edges so it looks like there's no actual stitching holding the lace down, but it does take a bit of extra time. And finally, I can add buttons. It took me forever to figure out how to use a buttonhole foot, but it is amazing when it works. It almost didn't work this time because of the fabric just a little too thick for it, but with a little tugging and pushing from me, we were able to get her done. Then I need to figure out where the button goes and whip it into place. I usually do 4 or 5 stitches through the holes. In this case, there was just the one hole, using 2 strands on my needle. Then I wrap my thread a couple of times underneath the base of the button and finally tie it off on the wrong side. You know how I said that the buttons was the last part of this project? Well, I've kind of changed my mind. I happen to have a beautiful white fur that I used on my Eevee project at the beginning of last year, and I've had no use for it, so it's just been hanging out in my room. But what better use for white fur than a Christmas project? And where else to put them than on the trim of the coat? Which of course means that all of my hand-felled edges are now going to be sacrificed to the sewing gods. I was originally thinking about maybe just adding it to the hood and possibly the bottom of the coat where the horsehair braid was, so that you wouldn't be able to see kind of the stiff section of the coat. But then my sister showed me a picture of Martha May from The Grinch and her beautiful robe that is trimmed with fur all over, and I was like, yes, my coat needs that. So I needed to cut out 3-inch strips of my fur fabric, but I once again couldn't find my chalk, so I was forced to use pen. But that's okay, because those 3 inches includes a 1/2-inch seam allowance on both sides. Well, at least it would if I actually used it correctly. Apparently there's a special kind of tool that you can use to cut fur from the wrong side so you don't accidentally cut the fur at the edges too short too. And I've heard that you can also use like a straight edge blade, but I don't have that. So I just use my seam ripper. It's not nearly as good, but it doesn't cut nearly as much of the strands short as my actual sewing scissors do. Disclaimer though, I have no idea what this is doing to the sharpness of the blade of my seam rippers. Where I have the horsehair braid, I line the fur 1/2 inch away from the edge of the velvet with right sides together, and then, with the velvet on top, I ran it through the sewing machine following my felled stitches. This will ensure that any weird lumps caused by the braid will be hidden behind the fur. Then I flip the fur over to hand stitch in place. I totally forgot to take into account how much volume I was going to have to be flipping over with that 1/2-inch seam allowance on the one side, so I just left the other side raw against the coat so I wouldn't be too bulky. This I'm just going to whip in place with white thread, making sure to stay within my stitch line so it won't be visible on the other side. And since I'm making it so it's within the fur trim, I don't have to be really careful when I am whipping this into place. So it went a lot faster than it normally does. I also did the same thing on the front of the bodice, excluding that strip that goes under the bust. I just felt like the fur trim would be too large for that section. And here it is, my Christmas coat. I'm not wearing the right outfit that goes underneath it because I was getting ready for work and I kind of don't have enough time to do a whole separate outfit for work, but just kind of tuck my hair in so you can at least see where the fur is. And the gold lace trim. I really like the hood. The only problem with my hood is that it doesn't want to stay on my head. The only reason it's currently staying on my head is because I'm wearing a headband, which is giving it enough grip so that it's not falling off. But it falls off like all the time. So that's a bit of an issue, but it's not horrible. I really like the fur trim all the way around. I do think the Martha May idea was for the best. There are some areas, like in this corner here, that they didn't do a very good job of attaching the fur, but the fur is so big that it's not very noticeable. I wish that my coat had a bit more volume in the skirt. I just don't think it has enough. It does have a bit of a swoosh, especially when I'm walking, but I really would have wanted like a big swoosh that would have made my life, like, that would have made my ideal fantastical coat. The buttons, I really like the buttons. They're just some cheap buttons that I bought a while ago. I have like 50 million of them. So I was like, ooh, I'm gonna use those buttons. And they were perfect. The sleeves are a little short. They come above the wrist when I put my arms forward, but when my arms are down, it's not super noticeable, especially with the extra fur, which is one of the reasons I was glad to add fur, to give some length to my sleeves. This fabric totally sheds sparkles everywhere though. I wore it to work before it was fully done, and one of my coworkers was joking that she wanted some sparkles like from Tinkerbell, so I went over to her and I just like shook my skirt and it dropped sparkles all over her, and now the fur is making it shed even more. So like, this is a very sheddy coat. But anyway, I'm super happy with it. There's some things that I'm like, ooh, about, but they aren't things that are super noticeable, except for the hood. I wish I had lined the hood, because it's not noticeable when it's up, but when it's down you can definitely see the raw edges of the seam in the hood. But yeah, I'm like super happy with this. So if you enjoyed this video, then please give me a thumbs up. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything of the like, go ahead and put it down below. And if you'd like to see any of my future projects, I have quite a lot planned for next year, though whether or not I'll get them all done, that's another story entirely. Then please subscribe. I hope you all had a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and I hope to see you in the future. Bye!